Good evening, folks, and welcome to the first History Hour of 2026 with the Sullivan-Sorrento Historical Society. This program will be recorded and added to our YouTube channel shortly. We are very pleased to have as our presenter tonight Dr. Patrick Callaway. He is the collections manager at the Mount Desert Island Historical Society and earned his PhD in history from the University of Maine in 2019, focusing on the economic connections between New England and British Canada during the period leading up to and after the American Revolution through to the War of 1812. Tonight, he'll be presenting on the Maine that never was and the British plans for Downeast Maine. Welcome, Patrick. It's great to have you here tonight.
Inviting me, and thank you. And thank you for everyone that has come out for the first of well, hopefully will be an extensive series of history nights for us. So I came by this project in sort of a strange way. And I was doing some research on economic trade, sort of the broad history types of things that historians like to think about. And then I ran into a source and that talked about the establishment of Dalhousie University up in Halifax and a plaque that they have up there on their campus. And on the plaque, it tells a story of how the origins of the university are from a customs house in Castine. Like, well, on the surface of it, this makes no sense. It's a different country. How did this come to be? So as I started to dig in further and further, as historians do, we tend to dig our holes deeper, 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 to where I hit this very strange and broad topic of how the British had plans for what we now know as American territory, the state of Maine. So, of course, seeking wisdom, as soon as I can find my arrow, there we go. Doctor Who explains everything. Sometimes we have to forget what we know, and we have to forget that the national boundaries that we are so used to and that now have centuries of history behind them, if we go back far enough, those boundaries and those lines make no sense. They don't exist yet. And that the stories that are being told as we go through this history, well, that is what is constructing those national boundaries and making those circumstances to where a sign out in front of a university, which seems so off, actually makes perfect historical sense. So as the doctor reminds us, sometimes we have to forget what we know, and sometimes history is this unusual, twisting, winding tale that for the people at the time does not have a clear conclusion. And that as people here in the present, we tend to associate our history with a known answer. Looking back, that makes sense. Looking forward, that does not. So just a reminder for me and a reminder for us. So I'm going to start the story in 1770 and a map in the state archives laying out the territory of Maine. Now, this map looks a little strange, not quite filled in. It's not a coincidence. The geography of Maine remained a little bit obscure in some parts, especially in the northern part of the state, well into the 19th century. But this map is interesting for another reason, because it introduces a new geographic term, that of New Ireland. So New Ireland in the history is traditionally associated with a British colony that was going to be established after the Revolution. But here we see the title on the land already. And this I have not yet been able to explain on how the label from after the Revolution shows up on the map from 1770. I'm still looking for answers on that one. But we do see some other historical references here. So Nova Scotia, we have the St. John's through here is the river. So notice we go into New Brunswick a little bit. We have the territory of New Ireland, territory of Sagadohawk. So if we think back all the way into the 17th century, we have a reference back to the earliest Popham colony back in 1605. So this is a landscape that in many ways is not well known even into the mid and latter part of the 18th century. So where do we start drawing boundaries? Where do we start drawing lines? Well, this is not necessarily intuitive at the time. Now, 1770, the revolution, as we know looking back, is on the horizon. They did not know, but we move forward a little bit. So 1775, we're very familiar with the events that break out there. The first shots in Machias Bay, at Concord, at Lexington, and the subsequent revolution that breaks out. So the Declaration of 1776, so the Declaration of Independence, declares a political independence. The question, though, is what will the parameters of this new nation look like, and would it even survive? So this is a question that in many ways takes us away from Maine. If we think of the traditional stories that we're familiar with the Revolution, following figures like a Washington or a Jefferson or a Noah Franklin, those are stories that really don't come to us here on the Maine coast. But we do have a very deep involvement with the Revolution, not only with Machias and those shots in 1775, but with the destruction of Falmouth. So a little bit later in 1775, a short-lived expedition by land to try to conquer Nova Scotia, which does not work out well for the Americans. But an even more significant encounter with the Revolutionary history comes in 1779, and what becomes known as the Bagaduce or Maja Bagaduce. There's about 7 or 8 different spellings of each of those. We know it as present-day Castine, Maine. So Castine, it gets its name in 1796. So there's a town meeting. They decide to change the name. So just for ease of reference, I'm just going to use Castine, just because it's a lot easier to keep track of than trying to go through and change multiple names as we go through. So Castine is a rarity on the Maine coast. It is a deep water protected harbor, which would allow any number of merchant vessels, a naval base, but also some other opportunities for the British. So 1779, the war in the northern colonies is pretty well concluded. There's a major British base in New York, another in Halifax, and there is a deep concern about that line of communication. There's fear of American privateers. There's fear potentially of another land invasion into Nova Scotia. The British command decides that they want to establish a base somewhere between New York and Halifax. Castine comes to mind. It is distant enough from places like a Falmouth or Boston, where there might be a buffer there based on the geography. So it's far enough away, perhaps, that it could be defended. It is that deep water harbor that the British are seeking, but it also presents an opportunity to establish a new colony, that of New Ireland. One of the undertold pictures of the American Revolution is the fate of the Loyalists, so those that remained loyal to the crown after 1775. To British authorities, they have a sense that these unfortunate people who have been, in many ways, hounded out of their homes, have lost their property because of their loyalty to the crown, deserve to be taken care of in some way. In the context of the 18th century, that means land. It means settlement. So all things come together at Castine. There's land available. There's a deep water port. It's on that line of communications between Halifax and New York. So this is going to be a place where a new colony can perhaps take root. So in the summer of 1779, the British send out a small fleet, so a small Royal Navy task force, and about 600 men under a guy by the name of Brigadier General Francis McLean. And their job is to establish a fort, to secure the vicinity, to secure the port, and to start providing a potential place for these unfortunate loyalists to settle. So word gets back to Boston and the Massachusetts authorities very quickly. Remember, at this time, Maine is part of Massachusetts. So this is an invasion of Massachusetts soil that their authorities are just not going to allow to go unchecked. So in a pretty amazing feat of 18th century government and logistics and military uh, expedition, they are able to put together an expedition to go take Castine back. Well, to do this, they need ships. So there's a unit, the frigate Warren, of the Continental Navy. They're ships from Massachusetts, from Connecticut, from all over the place that come together for this expedition. By the time they arrive in Castine, they have a total of 39. They need an army. So where can men be found that would be able to come here and to Castine on short notice? At the time, if you were a male and if you were of an age and condition, you were part of the militia. So they recruit militia, people who had day jobs as fishers, as farmers, as merchants, whatever their profession was, who would be able to serve in the army, at least for a short period of time, and for this specific purpose. So as the fleet leaves Boston, they're still recruiting as they go through the main port towns as they come up the coast. So by the time they reach Castine, they have somewhere around 1,200 men, mostly militia, a handful of Continental Marines. On the surface of things, this is a very bad place to be if you are the British. The fortification that they are trying to build, later named Fort George, is not completed. There's no walls on two sides. The walls are about 2 feet tall on the other two. So not a really defensible location. In numbers of men, Maclean's outnumbered roughly 2 to 1. In ships, a guy by the name of Henry Moat, who is infamous for the burning of Falmouth some 3 years or 4 years prior, well, he commands 3 Royal Navy ships. So he is outnumbered 11 to 1 in ships. And if we look at the number of guns and of men, it's even worse. Under the rules of the day, they had to make an honorable resistance before they could surrender with their honor intact. So this puts the initiative in the hands of the Americans. The question becomes, how is this campaign to be conducted? Now remember, this is a naval fleet that is being put together on the fly. This is an army that is being put together on the fly, and there is a great deal of amateurism involved. So they decide that if everybody goes at the same time, that will be successful. So if we see our map over here, the idea is that the Navy, led by the Warren, will come into Castine Harbor, attack the British ships that are lined here, force the harbor, provide covering fire across the peninsula. Meanwhile, the Army, led by the Marines, will come up through the cliffs, the Penobscot River cliffs, through the woods, and meet at the fort. So this is defended territory. However, remember the British are heavily outnumbered. So as the Warren goes into the harbor, it is damaged. So gunfire from the shore puts a cannonball into the mainmast. The ship is saved, so a pretty good feat of seamanship, but the Navy retreats. The commander of the Navy, a guy by the name of Dudley Saltonstall, is unwilling to go into the mouth of Castine Harbor again until somebody does something about the gun batteries on the shore. So this puts the weight onto the Army. So, in a very interesting and opposed landing, the Continental Marines swarm up the cliffs through the woods with the militia following. However, imagine you are a militiaman. You've been on the farm. This is not your profession. There's the stress of battle, the confusion that comes with an opposed landing. The American Army, command and control starts to break down. The Army stops. So what's now known as Witherly Woods, so if we're up in this corner, that level of confusion leads for them to stop, and the Army starts to dig in. We have a conflict back and forth between the Army and the Navy. The Navy is not really interested in charging into the harbor again. The Army is not wanting to go charging and attack Fort George until somebody does something about the British Navy. So our first position here, and then a little bit later back towards what's now the town of Castine. This devolves into a siege, which was not to the benefit of the Americans. They start to set up gun batteries. So one on the island across the harbor, which does force the British fleet to move back. Unfortunately, the guns are not large enough and cannot be elevated enough to hit the British positions further up on the peninsula. So that's a problem. Command and control is also a problem. So a very famous figure for us, fans of the American Revolution, Paul Revere, is the colonel commanding of the artillery. What is his credentials for the job? He's a staunch revolutionary, so he's loyal to the cause, which, in a revolution that is significant. But he's not a trained artilleryman either. So there is another point of dysfunction. There is skirmishing that we see go back and forth. It's a little bit off of our map, but if we go over this way, over what's now Hatch Cove, we see more gun batteries there. So this is turning into a siege. The fifth theory here is that if the American Army, American Navy holds on long enough, the British will be forced to surrender. They will eventually run out of men, they'll run out of supplies, food, what have you. Well, that only works if there's no rescue coming. And in the case of the British, word of the plight of Maclean's garrison had already reached Halifax and reached Nova Scotia. So Halifax has no help to send. Nova Scotia is very lightly manned already. There's only a few handfuls of soldiers guarding Halifax itself. There's no fleet to send. Word reaches New York, though, that this siege is occurring, and the commanding officer there, Sir George Collier, puts together everything that will float. So a ship of the line, a series of frigates, so very heavily armed, if somewhat small British squadron coming to the relief of Fort George and the besieged garrison. He arrives the day that the Americans finally decide what the attack plan is again. The American fleet is destroyed. It is the worst naval disaster in American history up until Pearl Harbor. The Army, quite literally, is forced to walk home. Well, this secures the area effectively for the British. They control the sea lanes. The fort, as we go through 1779, 1780, and 81, is firmly established. And a small community of loyalists, somewhere around 2 to 3, perhaps 400 people, start to gather in the region. From the British perspective, this is what success looks like. Perhaps not on the scale they had hoped. From the American perspective, however, this is disastrous, particularly for Massachusetts, because they see this as occupied Massachusetts soil. Unfortunately, there is not enough money, not enough ships, and not enough men to do anything about it militarily, at least at the time. So if you were around in 2015, you'll remember the visit of the French replica frigate Hermione. That comes directly from 1780. The French Navy set up a frigate to reconnoiter the position, fires one shot, essentially to let the British know they were there, and sail off. As we go through the Revolution, there are simply not the resources available for the Americans to recapture the position. I share this map just because it's kind of fun. It's one of the earlier maps of the campaign. For reasons unknown, the mapmaker put the Penobscot River on the wrong side of the peninsula. Um, Not entirely sure why, but if you imagine the river on the other side, it's a pretty decent outline of what happened. So by the time it's completed, we get into now 1781, 82. Fort George is a pretty formidable position. So for fans of European fortifications of the time, this looks very familiar. The view that you see on the bottom here, this was the mapmaker's view from across the harbor. So we have a very significant and strong fortified position that in many ways is formidable for American attackers. It is going to take artillery. It is going to take a lot. From the Loyalist perspective, this provides security. This is proof that the British government has their interest at heart. They are providing a military garrison. They are providing fortifications. They are providing protection. They're providing access to trade through the port. In many ways, this is a settlement that has very strong attachments to the British, as you might expect. As we progress, there is the desire to set up that new colony in a more formal way. So if you remember back to our first map, so that New Ireland idea, well, this is what they want to establish. So a petition is sent to London in order to try to make this a reality. So what they proposed is essentially everything from the Penobscot east and north would go into New Ireland. Well, it begs a problem here. Most of that territory is not effectively controlled by the British. There is some American settlement. But remember that the Native Americans still effectively control most of this territory. So in many ways, they are trying to establish a colony on land that they do not control. Nonetheless, this is the proposal that is sent to London. So very nice document here, and uh, uh, the transcription of at least part of it here. This was the Loyalist desire. So we have a very strong set of advocates for this colony. The difficulty is that the number of loyalists that they had hoped to come into Castine just was not up to what they were hoping for. It was significant in terms of there being a couple hundred of people there, but in terms of this providing a refuge for loyalists more broadly, the colony is not really all that successful. During the Revolution, we see tens of thousands of loyalists. So I've seen numbers ranging anywhere from 60 to 100,000 and pretty much everything in between on the number of loyalists who remained with the crown during the Revolution. If the province was designed to be a refuge for those massive populations, this is not really all that successful. Could it potentially become something? Perhaps, given time, but that isn't how it plays out. So 1783 comes along. The United States wins the Revolutionary War with a great deal of help from France and other powers. The Treaty of Paris is signed, and the border for Maine now Massachusetts territory again, is set at the St. Croix River. This is the painting from the signing of the treaty. It's not a glitch. If you see the big white spot over here, the British were so upset about this that the commissioner that they sent refused to be set for the portrait. So they just left it blank. That territory now goes to the United States. Well, what happens to the Loyalists that did settle around Castine? They have a choice. They can either pick up and move, they can make an accommodation with American authorities and become Americans. But if they leave, there's a potential risk that they could lose everything that they have. They'd lose their homes, lose their land, lose their possessions. Or there's the third way. They can pick up their houses and move, and pick up their houses in a very literal sense. So this is a brief picture of what is a very wonderfully done historical quilt at the Castine Historical Society, outlining the entire history of the town in a quilted form. And this is the panel on 1783 and the evacuation of the Loyalists. So we see this rendition of them having houses up on rollers being pulled along out to the harbor and floated up into what is now still British territory, up around St. Stephen and St. Andrews and then there. So the British, they evacuate the Loyalists. The Loyalists, many of them choose to leave, but they take their stuff with them, which is a very significant conclusion to our first part of our story. So the first part of our story, that New Ireland colony, it didn't work out. Other forces, so other interests, came into being that did not allow for the New Ireland colony to really take root. So we move on. So we're going to jump ahead here a few years into our next map, possibly the favorite thing I've found in all my research. So the Arrowsmith map of Maine, and we see the St. Croix, so our border, and we have New Brunswick. We have the coast, that's pretty well outlined, so our down east region. But this note here at the top of the map is very interesting. It notes that the northern parts of the districts are full of lakes with many high mountains, but their situations are not correctly known. So we're into now the 19th century. That still has not been fully explored. Well, this leads to a problem. If we go back to the 1790s into the 1800s, there was an attempt to firmly set the border between British North America and Maine along the St. Croix River. They knew where the mouth of it was. The problem was they really didn't know where the rest of the river went. So what river do they follow on the map? There's a series of commissions in the 1790s that come back with inconclusive results on where the boundary is. On one hand, this is important. So we see the development of places like Eastport. Along the coast, we see a very clearly American and very clearly British spaces come up. But as we go up along the border, realistically, the border is a polite fiction. To the degree that people even recognize that it existed, it was mostly cheerfully ignored. Even those clearly defined port cities that we have in Maine and over in British North America, they tend to have a very loose relationship with government authority. Smuggling and trade is rampant, and much to the chagrin of mostly American officials and with the support of many British officials. But there is a cross-border community that develops, even if there is a separation in political leadership. So 1812, as we know, significant for our local history as well, because this is the outbreak of the War of 1812. So we have in Nova Scotia a governor by the name of Sir John Sherbrooke. He has absolutely no interest in a war with the United States. Nova Scotia is very lightly manned again. British authorities are concentrated on the war in Portugal and Spain, so fighting against Napoleonic Europe. And so, really, there's not a whole lot of interest in this conflict. Sherbrooke is also very interested in maintaining trade connections with the United States, particularly New England. Well, put all that together, he decides that he will put a opportunity forward, not just in an official way, but very directly appealed to the American Republic that if the American public, so Mainers, do not fire on British soldiers or British people, that peace would be maintained. Essentially, trade would continue and the war essentially would be put on hold. So we have to your right, so letter, it's a little bit before the war, so April of 1812. This is Sherbrooke writing to London, asking for permission to continue trade, just as if there were no political tensions and no conflict. This is agreed to and sustained even after the outbreak of war. So Sherbrooke literally puts an ad in the paper that puts forward his proposal of essentially we ignore the war. And largely, this is upheld from 1812 into the early part of 1814. It was in mutual interest back and forth for both Mainers and for British authorities and for the British that an active front does not pop up in Maine. This starts to transition. Now, part of the reason that it was easy to declare this unofficial peace is that Maine largely is out of sight and out of mind. If we think of the map of the War of 1812 up until 1814, most of our conflict is going to be here, so the Lake Champlain region, but even more over here, so over in Fort Niagara and what's now Western New York and Ontario, and even further west. The war had very little support in New England. Uh, New England had voted unanimously against the war, but this region starts to become a little bit more important. So we get into 1813. There is massive fighting in present-day Ontario, and the British have a need to resupply, especially men. Well, the problem is that the St. Lawrence freezes over. With the technology of the time, the British Navy merchant vessels could not get up the river. So how do you get men and resources from the Atlantic provinces over to the battlefront in Ontario? So what they do is that they rediscover, this was a well-known Native American trade route and communications route from Fredericton up the St. John, up through the county, and then down around the St. Lawrence. So this road, to the surprise of some, is completely feasible, especially during winter when the river is closed. So this means that Maine and securing Maine as at least a buffer is more significant. So we become part of the planning again. So 1814 comes along. We have an expedition sent out from Halifax. About 4,000 men show up in September of 1814 at present-day Castine again. And the idea that they have is an establishment or reestablishment of that New Ireland colony idea. That the new national boundary would be the Penobscot, and that everything to the north and east of the Penobscot would be part of a British colony. Well, that's a good idea. The question is, how do you do it? The American army is very lightly garrisoned in Maine by this time. The demands of the battlefronts back west have led to the removal of most of the regular troops. The militia is widely scattered. And by the time September comes along, the British are able to land with overwhelming superiority at Castine. The garrison there numbers about 40 men. They fire one shot for the honor of the flag and run for it. According to Castine tradition, the parson mason, the town pastor, goes out with a white bedsheet, rows out to the British fleet, and surrenders the town. That surrender is accepted, and the British start to move in. A little bit further up the Penobscot is an American naval ship, the Adams. The British Navy, British authorities wanted to capture or destroy the Adams, as well as to bring the war into Maine a little bit more further. So to gather supplies, to collect indemnities, to pacify the country in a very direct way. So they send about 600 men or so up the Penobscot, where they meet the American militia at present-day Hamden. So if you go through Hamden, if you're driving south on 1, so you have that first stream, you go through town, you have that second stream. This is right around where the battle takes place. So the American militia from all over down east comes to the battle. The battle lasts 15 minutes. British forces, so regulars, fighting against American militia. The American militia puts up a fight. Sailors from the Adams put up a significant fight, but this is a battle that is concluded pretty quickly. And as part of the surrender, everything in Maine from the Penobscot east is surrendered to British authority. So this is a wide tract of land. How are the British going to administer it? Well, we get an idea of that. So this is, if you look to the right, this is the battle map for the Battle of Hamden. A little bit more blurry on screen than I had thought, but over on the left, we have this proclamation to the citizens of Moose Island. So American territory, now under British occupation. And it says essentially that the municipal laws of the American government will be maintained until there is a resolution on a different form of government or a new colony or whatever it is to come. The only thing that is asked is an oath of allegiance. Many take the opportunity to give that oath. Some do not. The British administration of captured Maine is pretty mild in many ways. Looking into the documents of the Nova Scotia archives outlining the campaign, we see a great deal of emphasis put into trying to conciliate at least the quote unquote better parts of the American population to at least acknowledging British rule and not trying to lead a fight against it. The British troops, British authorities had no interest in a long-running guerrilla war through Downeast Maine. That's not what they want. They're willing to make deals with Americans to maintain the peace and to secure trade. In a really interesting case, one of the documents I found in other research was from Ellsworth, and some of the respectable citizens of Ellsworth arrived at the British fort in Castine asking to be able to keep their guns because they were concerned about how the lower sorts of people might react and feared for their property and their lives if they were disarmed. So the British authorities let them keep their weapons. So it's kind of an interesting side negotiation breaks out. For the British, the Castine area is going to be the place that they emphasize their power, where they put in their government, the trading post, the customs house. This is going to be the center of British authority in this new incarnation of New Ireland. They fortify the peninsula heavily. So if you've been to Castine, you see those signs all over the place. You know, the quote unquote historical signs. Some of them are more accurate than others. So as you're coming into town, one of the first ones you see is a sign advertising the British Ditch. 1779. The right part of the landscape, wrong year. It was the production of 1814 and 1815. So what they do is literally dig essentially what is a moat across the neck, connecting the two coves together and making Castine, at least for a time, an island. They reestablish and start to refortify Fort George. They put gun batteries along the water. They put gun batteries up in the woods. There's a blockhouse under what is now the town reservoir. For reasons unknown, they won't let us drain the reservoir and actually try to find it. Not sure why they would make that choice, but right at that height of land where the reservoir is now, on the military map and the engineering maps, there is a blockhouse under there. It's the one formation that we've never been able to find for obvious reasons. But if we go through the Castine Peninsula, there are fortifications, blockhouses, gun batteries all over the place. If you're on the Castine golf course, there's even the outlines of the earthworks of a fortification out in the middle of the golf course. So this is a very heavily fortified position. Much like we saw back in 1779 and 1780, the United States is unable to put together the forces to try to retake this territory. The men, the ships, and perhaps most importantly, the money just isn't there. We get an idea that this occupation was intended to be permanent because it is not just the fortifications, it is also some of the other things they set up, specifically the customs house. Now, under British law, if you were trading in the empire, you had to go to the customs house in order to pay your tariffs and pay your taxes. So much commerce goes in and out of Castine, as we'll see a little bit later on, that they're able to start a library with the income from it. We see cases of people like the merchant John Young of Halifax, who finds that Downeast Maine is actually so peaceful that he sends his trade by land through New Brunswick, through Maine, and to Castine, rather than risking sending it by ship where privateers might attack his holdings. On the surface of it, this seems very secure. Unlike what we saw with the first incarnation of New Ireland, we're not seeing a settlement of loyalists. We're not seeing a settlement of British subjects, but rather we are seeing a relatively mild administration where people perhaps might be reconciled to British rule. We get to the end of 1814, so Christmas Eve, 1814, a peace treaty is signed between the British and the United States. And what the peace treaty essentially says is that all land holdings that a country started the war with, they get to keep that. So there will be no exchange of territory. Well, we can tell a little bit of a difference from this and the Treaty of Paris we saw earlier. The British authorities decided that they'd actually appear in the portrait this time. So a mark of respect, perhaps, that was not extended back after the Revolution. But what this means for Castine and what this means for Downeast Maine is that they are going to be returned to American authority. So we get to April 1815, still celebrated as Evacuation Day. The British leave their posts at Castine. The boundary, however, still has not been fully decided, because if you remember back to our Arrowsmith map a couple of minutes ago, well, we're still not exactly sure what the terrain looks like in the northern part of Maine. This is going to be put over for later negotiations and try to sort that out, which, jumping forward quite a bit, we get to 1842, and we finally have that boundary established. So here we see this was the plan. So eastern and northern Maine to the British. This is what ends up happening, is the familiar shape of Maine that we see here. So to bring things full circle, to your right, you see the plaque that started this line of inquiry to start with. So Halifax and Castine. So the customs duties collected here, used by Dalhousie, so the successor to Sherbrooke, for the endowment of a garrison library and the college. So to me, it was a very interesting story of how we see the same landscape fought over, how our national boundaries were much more flexible and perhaps less settled than we would think looking back, but how that this administration, even under British authority, life continued. There was still trade. There was still things happening. So as we know, the boundary is established at St. Croix. Our boundary set, so the history that we're familiar with is eventually going to come to pass. But this is a very interesting example of some of the winding roads that our history takes to arrive at the present. All right, so thank you. So I believe we open up for questions now.
Yes, does anyone have any questions for Patrick? Living in the borderlands, we have a lot of interesting history and so much conflict, conflicting interests and cooperation, of course, to make things work and survive out in this remote frontier. Still pretty remote. All right. That's no questions. All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Patrick. It is, I loved the maps that you use. I loved the early documents. I just so thrilled to see those. It's, I'm thinking about the blockhouse, of course, in Castine. It's like, well, geez, that would be really great to be able to try and locate that if there was some way in the future that they might cooperate, but one never knows.
Yeah, there's no way they're going to let us drain the town reservoir looking for it.
Yeah, the town water. Yeah, exactly. I know this is so much that we would do for history, but
Well, they did just a couple of years ago finally get the stairs into the Penobscot shore. So you can actually go down the cliffs that the Marines charged up in 1775.
yes,
So,
yes. And I've been there, and that's, yeah, it's a fascinating place all around up in there. And of course, you want to go and find where Castine himself lived up, in that little nook in Penobscot after he moved off away from the fort. There's a question from DJ. And she says, what happened to town governments during that period? Our town records here in Sullivan identify the town as of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
right. So Maine still remains part of Massachusetts, so statehood's not until 1820. What the British authorities decide to do when they come back in 1814 is that they are not going to reestablish town governments. They're not going to reestablish a civil administration in a very direct way. What they are interested in is peace. They're interested in trade. They're interested in defending what they have because they conquered or captured quite a bit of territory in a very brief period of time. They don't have an interest in trying to run the day-to-day affairs of the towns. So what they decide to do is that they leave the town governments and American laws in place until such time as events warrant a change, whether that's peace and recognition of British government, which that would have changed our trajectory quite a bit, whether it's the territory that goes back to the United States, as we saw eventually play out. The British are just not going to be that deeply involved in the day-to-day administration. So as long as it didn't cost money, as long as it didn't cause any trouble, as long as taxes and the trade continued, they were very willing to allow American authorities to stay in place.
Thank you for that. Yeah, we have some interesting little anecdotes of occasional run-ins between a British, the odd British soldier and settlers in the Sullivan area trying to round up their sheep or whatnot. So they're funny little stories. I mean, nothing serious ever happened. It was just kind of a nuisance here and then. But yeah, we got through it and we're here today. And thank you so much for presenting for us tonight. There was one more question from Sam Younger. He says, how did the Bingham lands factor into this?
Yes, the real estate history gets really interesting because Bingham, of course, is tied in with the Baring Bank in London. So there is a very close connection between the landed interests, not only in Philadelphia, but also in London. Ashburton, so the guy that the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty is actually named after, his given name's Alexander Baring. So kind of an interesting connection. Formally, these lands are being conflicted at a political level. So who should rule over them, at least from the British perspective? Getting into land ownership, that's not something that they're willing to get involved with, at least at the stage that they arrived at. So even if we go back to the advent of New Ireland, land's not really explored that well. The boundaries are very undefined for the Bingham purchases and for other land holdings north and east of the Penobscot. So that's not at a place where those property holdings were tried in a direct way. Coming into, 1814, that's not something that the British administration wanted to get involved in. They're interested in peace, getting into discussions and debates over land boundaries, land ownership, even if there wasn't an absolutely massive conflict of interest. Well, it's not even a conflict of interest if I think about it. At a national level, it would be, but it's actually a confluence of interests if you think about it, between Bingham and British investors like the Barings of not interfering with property holdings. Of course, defining exactly what the boundaries of those property holdings are, well, that's part of the problem.
That's right. Right. Any other questions? I love talking about this. All
Yes,
right.
that's the hard part. If you can get me to stop talking about casting and history and Nova Scotia history and anything under an hour, that's an achievement.
Yes, I can very much relate. There's just, yeah, there's so much, so many layers to peel back, and yeah. But thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone for attending tonight. And next month's History Hour, we'll have a bit of Sorrento history with Sam Younger presenting on the story of Frank Jones, his mistress Delana Harrington Curtis, and the Rock End Cottage. And all right, we hope to see everyone then. And thank you again for being with us tonight. Have a
Thank you
great
for
evening.
having me. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.